You ready to rock?
Yeah, we're ready. Well, we're going to folk rather than rock today.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today we're going to talk about the life, death, and estate of somebody I'm afraid that you may not know, many of you. Hang with me, though. Those of you who are old enough to have listened to folk music in the 60s, 70s especially, somewhat in the 80s, would know this name, or at least you're fans probably of songs this person has written that you didn't know that they had written. So today's selection, incidentally, was mine, so I take responsibility if it turns out that this is not a popular life to study. But I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen. So Leonard Cohen is the subject today. And I can say also, Marley gave me this odd look when I mentioned that name. It was clear to me she had never heard of Leonard Cohen.
No, I had definitely never heard of him. But when I started digging in a lot more, I was like, oh, I have heard his music. And I know a bunch of, artists who have done covers of his music as well. So it was really interesting learning about him, though. He's very interesting.
Yeah, he's a fascinating person. And I've been a fan of Leonard Cohen, who's a folk singer, folk songwriter, poet, author, several books, just kind of a Renaissance man artistically. I've been a fan of him since I was in high school, oddly enough. Not that he was especially popular to people my age at that time, but I came across him through somebody I knew who was a college student and whose opinion I respected. As far as literature and things like that. So I was really impressed with the music. He's written so many great songs, and he's just a marvelous writer. I mean, when Bob Dylan is a fan of your stuff, then you know you're good. But Leonard Cohen is somebody who influenced a lot of folk singers, and many of whom used his songs. But he himself just tended to be in the background much of the time.
Yeah, which I found really interesting because, we were talking about it. He's released 15 studio albums, 10 live albums. So, not anybody who's released only like one or two throughout their lifetime. He's won multiple Grammys. He won multiple Juno Awards, which is the equivalent of a Grammy in Canada.
In Canada. He's from Canada.
Yeah, and he was inducted into like the Canadian Hall of Fame, our Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rolling Stones listed him as like number 103 on their top 200 artists of all time.
Wow,
list.
103 is a good.
Yeah, so I was like, I don't know how I didn't know this guy, but I do know his music, so.
Yeah, and just to give you a sense of the people who have performed his stuff, and this is a short list, Johnny Cash, R.E.M., U2, Judy Collins, a big fan of his. She asked him to join her on stage during her concerts. James Taylor, Bob Dylan, Katie Lang, Velvet Underground, Courtney Love, Rufus Wainwright, Joe Cocker, Pentatonix, Nirvana. What do you think is the best known song that he wrote?
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
By far. Pentatonix has beaten that song into the ground.
Well, and when you have I don't know if it's a book that was written about it or it was, I know there's a documentary done about the course of that song, how it's made its way into the fabric of modern America and the number of people that have done it. There have been so many covers done of that song.
A lot. That is like one of my favorite Christmas songs, actually. And then we were talking about how it's in Shrek as well.
Oh, I had forgotten that.
Yeah, and it's right like in the middle. But I think a lot of people probably know it from Shrek, oddly enough. But I kind of find that funny. So.
Huh. Well, it's a gorgeous song.
It is. It is. Shrek was an odd fitting for it, but.
But my hope would have been that when he achieved this popularity, later in life, and he was a little older when he wrote Hallelujah. I think he wrote it in the 80s. that these people would be inclined to go back and listen to his other stuff.
Yeah. I kind of found that odd that people didn't. Like you said, he really had a cult following. So I guess, he had people who loved his music, but he wasn't really like one of the best known folk singers or singers of all time.
He was just known to people who perform folk
him.
music.
Yeah.
Not so much the protest stuff. This was more after 65. But he was an icon in the industry. So he was kind of a musician's musician or a poet's poet in that way.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
And I wonder if it's almost kind of the same thing as John Denver, that we were talking about this last time, or last episode. But, in like the 60s, 70s, folk wasn't a huge thing. It wasn't even really considered like a category of music necessarily, because they had to be grouped in with all the country singers. So I almost wonder if he put everything out and then, he became popular and people just never went back to listen to him, because I don't think they realized that a lot of his stuff was folk in, the early 2000s and everything like that. So I wonder if it was just kind of the timing of everything.
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
So give an overview of his life, which I knew comparatively little about. Though I was a fan of Leonard Cohen, I didn't know a whole lot about his early life.
Yeah, so he was born in September 1934 in Quebec, Canada. He comes from a pretty good family. His dad did die when he was 9, so we'll kind of see that pop up in like his albums and his short stories and poems. But he had a really good home life. He went to school and did very well in school. He was super into his extracurriculars. He was like the president of a lot of different clubs, oddly enough. He was a cheerleader. He did a lot of different sports. And then it wasn't really until he got into high school that he was in a theater group, and he kind of started developing his love for music. And he learned how to play guitar, but not to like a very good extent. He could just play like the basics pretty much.
Like a lot of folk guitarists.
Yeah.
Really.
And he definitely, his mom is his biggest influence, is what he definitely says all the time on music, because she used to wander around the house singing, and they would sing at church. They were Jewish, and kind of developed his love of, synagogue. Oh my goodness. Kind of developed his love of music that way. But he really loved poetry, as we'll kind of see, and he loved writing. And I don't ever think that in his head he ever thought any of his writing would turn out to be music at all, because kind of when he released Suzanne, when he wrote Suzanne, his first big song, everybody was like, it was a poem first. Let me correct that. It was a poem first, and everybody was like, this would make a wonderful song. And he was like, no, there's no way, until somebody else covered it. And then he was like, wait a minute, that is good. I'm really good at writing all of this. So I just kind of found his childhood interesting, because he wasn't really exposed to music in the way that other artists that we've discussed were exposed to music. And he wasn't really pushed to do anything with it, or even his writing or anything like that.
Yeah. And he was always a spiritual seeker, too. And though he grew up Jewish, he wasn't comfortable with just that theological perspective.
Yeah.
But yet he took it very seriously. And this is very evident in much of his writing, the extent to which he was steeped in Old Testament history. So it afforded him lavish opportunities for metaphors, and he just wove in much of his songs these direct and indirect references to biblical things. But yet he would be considered at the least unorthodox as a Jewish person. But he for a while thought about going to rabbinical seminary. As a matter of fact, I think I read earlier that he did go, and I just couldn't find the reference in for today. But I'm pretty sure that he spent a period of time there in this rabbinical seminary, and then he later He went in very liberal, diverse directions. At one point, he spent time with this Zen Buddhist monk. And I mean a long time, like 7 or 8.
It was, like
a number of years.
Yeah.
And, during much of which there was things such as vows of silence. So, I mean, it was a pretty rigorous thing. So he was unusual in that way, but his whole life he had an interest in the spiritual.
Yeah. And I think he just kind of wanted to learn all about it. He traveled all over, as we'll see. But he did go to school at McGill University. He published his first poem there actually in 1954, and it was in a magazine. And it was actually published alongside a lot of his professors' works as well. So that was kind of interesting. And then he graduated in 55, and then he went on to publish his first book of poems in 56. And that was called Let Us Compare Mythologies. And he dedicated that one to his dad. But
then he ended up going to Columbia.
Yeah, then he ended up going to Columbia. He went to law school for like a half a second, went to Columbia, and then he decided, I don't really like grad school. So he kind of just did odd jobs, and thankfully his dad set up a good trust for him that he could live off of that while doing those odd jobs and really focusing on writing. And then, oddly enough, he traveled all the way to Greece and bought a house for $1,500 US in Greece. And from there came some of like his biggest works of, novels, poetry, everything like that. But he kind of just hunkered down there and wrote everything, living off of that trust, and decided he wanted to make it big as a novelist and a poet. And he didn't really, which was kind of odd. He did get some recognition, but he really got recognition once he got into the songwriting.
Yeah. And that tendency to live this sort of wandering, nomadic existence. He never really had roots, and he was very proud, though, of being Canadian. I mean, more than Canadian, from Quebec, which means, you're very French. So you're not simply Canadian, you're almost French.
Yeah.
And of course, he was fluent in the language, and there were some songs in which he sang in French, and so he was a man of the world, and he was not somebody who could live in one place very long, and it seems he was not somebody who could live for life with anybody in particular.
No.
He did have a lot of relationships. In his defense, these were not a series of marriages, which we've sometimes seen. He had a series of relationships, but oddly enough, he never married.
No, he never married at all. He had long-term relationships. He had the relationship through the 1960s with Marianne Elin, and
wrote a great song about that.
Yes, and everybody said that she was just his muse through the 1960s. And then eventually they split up. From everything that I read, it was pretty amicable, but I really think that he kind of was just moving on to a different part of his life, and that's why they moved, they split up, and they probably realized it's never going to lead to marriage or anything like that, and they were just ready to go. But from there, he had a couple more girlfriends. He was definitely a ladies' man, and he did have 2 kids out of a relationship, Lorca and Adam.
Yeah.
And he just never really settled down. Like you said, he was really a nomad. He really loved that life.
And and we'll talk a little bit about his financial success or lack thereof. It was kind of the ebbs and flows more of his career.
Yes.
He was not somebody who was conscientious about his money, like Bob Dylan, for example, Bob Dylan, though he seems pretty bohemian, and I'm sure in many ways he is and was bohemian, still he was pretty conscientious in terms of taking care of his money.
Yes.
And a lot of artists that would seem indifferent to such things, the Stones, the Beatles. But Leonard Cohen was that person who he wanted money when he needed it or when he had a specific purpose, but other than that, no. So as a songwriter, more than as the album sells, that's where his money came in, the performance by others of his music during the 60s and especially the 70s and thereafter to varying degrees. he did have enough income coming in to where it afforded him this ability to go and live, in Greece
Everywhere.
on a lonely beach for a year or two. And he did a number of things like that, including in France. And of course, he returned regularly to Canada. He liked New York City.
Yeah,
He liked
love New York
Montreal, though.
City.
Montreal was his city in Canada, and Montreal is a beautiful city if any of you have been there. So money to him was not an end in itself, and he didn't monitor his bank account until he was informed that he might be running low, and that kind of happened after, I guess, more after the 90s.
Yeah, and it was like 97 when all that started happening. But to drive that point home too, I was reading something about how when he wrote Suzanne, it was obviously the poem first and then turned into a song by Judy Collins. And the record company that he had signed with then, they kind of stole the rights from him, and they did it in just a really roundabout way so that he didn't get like any of the money or the proceeds from it.
Wow.
And somebody asked him if he was mad about it, and he was like, no, like music should be for everybody, or like my work should be for everybody. And he just didn't really care. So it was funny.
Yeah. And I think probably he became a little more responsible later in life for reasons in part relating to his two children. So before we resume talking about the finances and then go into his death, I didn't get the impression that he was real involved as a father. Did you read that?
No, and I didn't find like a ton on him, but I didn't get the impression of that either. And it's really odd because we'll kind of go on to see that like when the scandal happens in 2005, he wasn't even the one to discover it. Lorca, his daughter, was the one to discover it. So I think it was more like them caring for him versus him caring for them.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that when they were small, again, if somebody can find some literature or some information, research on this, that I'd be interested to know of him from a child's perspective as a father. But my impression is that he was, I hate to use the word self-absorbed, but he didn't demand much from anybody, and he was very interested in spiritual things. He was interested in religious things, more specifically. And if you listen to his songs, questions of God and eternity and sin and things like that, he really grappled with the responsibilities of men to do good and the consequences of that, et cetera. So I think that he lived a life largely of the mind, and I think that he did not focus so much on many of the things that most of us think are important.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't reflect as well on him, but there it is. I will say that his children, I think, worshipped him or looked up to him.
Yes.
I saw a couple of videos of his son on stage. And so his son went on stage with him, Adam, and did a few of his songs. So I think that his son and daughter both probably looked up to him. We'll never know if there were some resentments there.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that there necessarily are, just with everything that like they're going through now, but I do completely agree with what you're saying. I don't think he was necessarily absent. I think like his mind was probably just absent from being a dad, and that probably plays into his dad died when he was pretty young, so he didn't really grow up with one, so he didn't really know how to be that father figure, that quote unquote good father figure, but he was there in ways that he should have been. I mean, monetary, he probably wasn't there all the time because when they were born, he was touring a lot, and then he went into the monastery, and so they probably were just used to their dad being one of those people who just was a free spirit and kind of did everything that like he wanted to.
And they probably were not used to seeing him regularly in that way.
Yeah, and I think both of them are honestly that same way though. So I don't think they really hold any of that resentment for him just because they have that same personality type and they kind of understand it.
Yeah, I can see him definitely in his son. His son looks like the dad. Adam does. I don't know that I haven't seen a recent picture of Lorca, but
Lorca's beautiful. I saw like a little bit older one of her, but she was still an adult and she's gorgeous. So she looks a lot like her mom.
So we should also know a little bit of the financial background too. Is that you mentioned, you alluded to this, but his father was pretty affluent.
Yes.
I see pictures of them with a video cam where they had the chauffeur was opening the door. The chauffeur in uniform was opening the door for him and his sister to go to school.
Yes.
And so I think that the family was affluent. The father had the foresight to create a trust for his son. And sometimes, incidentally, when you're a trust baby, as the phrase is, that may not be good for your character, and that's true. We know that, but it doesn't mean that it has to have that consequence. You could have trusts, as we've described at length on this show, where you don't increase the probability that your child will become just kind of a person without any responsibility or goals. And I will say Leonard Cohen was always very productive. He's left a life's work of hundreds or thousands, I suspect, of poems, hundreds of songs. The books that he's written, art. He also created art that is on exhibit in a museum in Montreal. Is it Montreal?
Yes, Montreal.
So he was a productive person, but at the same time, he lived just this very unorthodox, nomadic life. Now, when he had a couple of albums that did really poorly, one that was produced by Phil Spector, who we did a show on Phil Spector. He was insane. So there's even a story where he put a gun to Leonard Cohen's head in the studio. And I don't doubt this is true. You can look this up if you put in these keywords: gun, Spector, Leonard Cohen. And Leonard Cohen dealt with it very coolly. I mean, I was amazed, but he's the sort of guy that was imperturbable. But he also knew that he was dealing with a guy who was insane. So I think that he wrapped that up. But we're at a point in the production where he had to let him finish, and he did finish largely on his own, which means he put in the orchestration, he did the mixing. So he decided how much embellished or overproduced it was, and it was very embellished and very overproduced. Leonard Cohen despised the album. I mean, he was ashamed of the album.
Yeah, everybody said it didn't even sound like him.
No.
Yeah.
Phil Spector was caught in a formula that worked in the mid-'60s, and he was trying to use it in 1989 or whenever it was. So there was a period when he did have enough money that was flowing for him to, live this lifestyle he wanted. He supported his kids. So that I want to be clear is that he always provides support for his kids. And then he decides that once it comes to his attention that he's been defrauded by a manager who was subsequently convicted, who stole like $5 million from him, went ahead and sold the rights to some songs behind his back. And but because it was fraud, I assume that he was able to unwind those deals. We don't know. We do know that he won the litigation that took place later.
She, her name was Kelly Lynch, and she embezzled that $5 million, and he took her to court, and he won. And so they said, pay everything back, but she avoided all.
She was broke.
Yeah, she avoided everything. And they never really caught her. He never got any of the money back, which was really sad. I think he got maybe bits and pieces, but it was never going to be paid back in full. And she was eventually arrested for harassment of him in 2012, but she only got 5 months in jail and 12 months of probation, which I was for embezzling $5 million, and all of her other stuff that followed up after that was just so little. Which was just insane to me.
And it might have been a civil suit on the $5 million. So, no, you're right. I think that after she had done this, she had no assets, and she had probably had a bunch of personal problems. And I think that it was kind of uncollectible, the judgment. So, and even that, I'm sure, was initiated by the children. So, Leonard Cohen is not that, as we mentioned, is not that inclined to be conscientious in that way, but I think that he recognized at that stage, and even commented in a couple of interviews that he might have to go back to work. So here he is. He's older. His health is probably starting to fail a little bit, but in the early 2000s, especially after this fraud situation where a good portion of what he had left in savings was gone through this mismanagement or theft. So he then realized that he needed to go back to work and generate more money. And I think a further impetus for that was when he won in 2008. Was it a Grammy?
It was a Grammy, yes. It was for the Lifetime Award or something like that, Lifetime Achievement. Yeah. So his name was bigger in the U.S., which was kind of odd because the U.S. was not a place that his music or his literature ever did very well. But I mean, he was definitely recognized.
Yeah. He personally was very well known. In Canada, he's an icon.
Yes.
He's Bob Dylan in Canada. But in Europe, he was very well known. And his books, his poems, his music sold well. But as you point out, in the U.S., people knew the songs because somebody else sung them.
Yes.
But they didn't know him that well. But there was this core cult following, people who thought, wow, what a great writer he is, and who followed him. He decides in the aftermath, in the wake of winning this 2008 Grammy Award and seeing the level of attention out there when he was thinking that he was kind of irrelevant at that stage, he rallied and he said, look, I want to get serious about getting back to traveling and performing. And he did. There were two series of tours that he did, one in 08, 09.
One in 08, 09, and the next in 10 and 11, I believe.
Or 12 and 13. Anyway, so there were two tours, and they were both very successful. And he didn't realize that there was this groundswell of support for him that many people did not know about. In part, it was a product of people's familiarity with the originals that did his song, but others they had heard Jeff Buckley do Hallelujah, and that became the doorway for them to begin investigating this performer and learning about him. And the more they listened, the more they liked. And all of a sudden, he had this new fan base of people under 30.
Yeah, and I was reading a lot about how, and these were world tours also, I was reading a lot about how he was just still such a vibrant performer, and that it was he didn't age a day over 30, or when he was, going on world tours.
Good.
And people just loved him. He was such a great performer, and he just engaged the crowd. And like you said, he had that cult following, which I know that some artists have it, but after a while it just kind of dissipates, but his never did, which is just crazy. And I think speaks very much to his work that he still had that cult following through his entire life, from that very first poem book to the very end and beyond.
And then picking up the additional followers.
Yeah.
So he had that weird experience that I'm sure is rare, where an artist who's old is suddenly cool. And he was very cool in the teens, the 2000s teens. So we're going to stop here and break this show into two parts. We often feel that our audience prefers it, in that maybe 2 25-minute segments will be good. And there is more content here than is our goal, I guess. Although we're regularly over. Anyway, so we're going to break this into two parts. This concludes the first part, and you can pick up the second part. Will be posted immediately. Thank you. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.